The shifting shadows. The small town of Blackwater was known for its peaceful, uneventful existence. Nestled deep within a thick forest, it was a place forgotten by time. But everything changed after the sudden and mysterious death of old man Rutherford. Rutherford had lived alone for decades in a crumbling house on the outskirts of town. No one had seen him in years, but one day a neighbor noticed a foul smell coming from his property. The authorities found his body seated in an old armchair, as if he had been waiting for something. They ruled his death as natural, but his passing triggered something far from natural. Strange occurrences began almost immediately. Townsfolk started noticing unusual changes in the shadows. At first, it was subtle. A tree's shadow would shift slightly out of place, or a person's shadow would seem to move, even when they were still. People brushed it off, thinking it was just their imagination. But for Jenny, a local school teacher, the nightmare became all too real. It was a typical evening with Jenny sitting in her living room grading papers. Her cat, Midnight, lay beside her. The soft hum of her lamp filled the room. But something felt off. She noticed Midnight's shadow wasn't lying still like the cat. It writhed on the wall, curling and uncurling as though it had a mind of its own. Her heart began to race. She blinked several times, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The cat hadn't moved, but its shadow had shifted higher on the wall, looming larger than the actual animal. Jenny snapped on every light in the house, but the shadows didn't retreat. If anything, they thickened, turning darker, more defined. Every object in her house cast a shadow that seemed unnaturally long and wrong. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, but deep down she knew something far more sinister was at play. Panicking, she called her friend Mark, the local historian, and the closest thing Blackwater had to an expert on the supernatural. Mark arrived the next evening with a bundle of old town records and a healthy dose of skepticism. "It's probably just the stress getting to you," Mark said as he sifted through the ancient papers. But as night fell, the shadows in Jenny's house began to shift again, creeping along the walls in ways that defied logic. Mark's face turned pale. He grabbed one of the oldest records and began reading aloud. The tale was from the late 1800s, a time when Blackwater had seen a string of disappearances. According to the document, these vanishings were linked to creatures known as shadow walkers. These entities fed off the life force of living beings by attaching themselves to their shadows. They would grow stronger until they could fully consume their host, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell. Mark and Jenny exchanged terrified glances. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and the temperature dropped. Shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching out toward them like dark tendrils. Mark frantically flipped through the documents, searching for a solution. "Salt," he muttered. "They can't cross a line of salt." They scrambled to the kitchen, dumping salt across every doorway and window. The shadows recoiled as if they had been burned, but they didn't retreat entirely. They lingered just beyond the salt line, waiting, watching. For days, Mark and Jenny barricaded themselves inside the house, unable to leave. The shadows prowled outside, growing bolder with each passing hour. They whispered in voices neither of them could understand, but the meaning was clear. The shadows were hungry, and sooner or later they would find a way in. The days stretched into weeks, and the isolation began to take its toll. They couldn't leave, couldn't ask for help. The shadows had cut them off from the rest of the world, turning their once peaceful town into a prison. Mark grew weaker, his face pale, his eyes sunken. Jenny feared the worst. Were the shadows already feeding on him? One night, as the clock struck midnight, the whispers grew louder. The shadows swirled around the house, pressing harder against the salt barriers. Jenny knew they couldn't hold out much longer. In a final, desperate act, she grabbed a knife and began carving symbols from the old records into the doorframe. The shadows howled in pain as the symbols flared with a blinding light. For a moment, the darkness lifted and the shadows retreated, but the victory was short-lived. As the light dimmed, the shadows crept back, stronger than before. They had been waiting, biding their time. In the end, there was no escape. Mark disappeared first, his shadow dragging him into the dark. Jenny was left alone, trapped in a house surrounded by shifting shadows that would soon claim her too. The disappearing road. The road that connected Milton to Farview was a desolate, winding path through dense forests and steep hills. Known as the Disappearing Road, it had been the site of numerous unexplained vanishings over the years. Locals avoided it at all costs, but for Tom Rollins it was a necessary route. Tom was a traveling salesman, used to driving long distances late at night. He had taken the Disappearing Road many times without issue, so when his GPS routed him that way after a late meeting, he didn't think twice. It was just another drive, until it wasn't. As soon as Tom turned onto the road, the air felt different. The trees lining the road loomed larger than he remembered, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. A thick fog began to roll in, reducing visibility to nearly zero. Tom switched on his high beams, but the light barely cut through the dense mist. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his unease growing. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of the usual landmarks he expected. The sharp turns felt more disorienting, and soon it felt like he was driving in circles. His GPS flickered and then lost signal altogether. Tom cursed under his breath. He knew this road well, so why did it feel so foreign now? An hour passed, then two. His fuel gauge dipped lower. Panic set in as Tom realized he hadn't seen another car in hours. He slowed the car and checked his surroundings. That's when he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, shrouded in fog. Tom slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't move. It was tall, with long limbs and a featureless face. Tom blinked, and the figure vanished into the mist. Shaken, he pressed on, but the road seemed to change with every turn. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the road behind him. His headlights flickered as if the car itself was struggling to stay in the physical world. Suddenly the car sputtered and died, leaving Tom stranded in the middle of nowhere. He stepped out of the car, but an eerie silence that set his teeth on edge. He tried walking back the way he came, but after 10 minutes of walking, he found himself back at the car. Confused and scared, he realized he was trapped. The road had disappeared. As he stood by his car, the figure from before reappeared in the distance, its shadowy form flickering in and out of view. But this time, it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the fog, all featureless and tall, moving slowly toward him. Tom scrambled into the car and locked the doors, his heart racing. But the figures kept coming, their silhouettes pressing against the windows surrounding him. Suddenly, the car began to move on its own. The engine roared to life, but Tom wasn't in control. The car sped down the road, swerving dangerously around bends and cliffs. The figures chased him, keeping pace no matter how fast the car went. The road stretched endlessly before him, with no end in sight. Tom screamed, but there was no one to hear him. The car careened off the edge of a cliff, plunging into the fog below. In the end, Tom became just another name on the list of those who had vanished on the disappearing road. The house on Sycamore Lane. The house on Sycamore Lane had stood abandoned for decades. Its windows were shattered, its paint long faded, and its front porch sagged like a weary old man. Yet, despite its dilapidated appearance, it held a sinister allure for those who dared to venture near. For years, the townspeople whispered about the strange occurrences that took place there, the eerie lights, the disembodied voices, the figures that seemed to move inside when no one was home. When Emily and Jack Henderson moved to Stillwater, they were drawn to the old Victorian house. They had been looking for a project, and the house on Sycamore Lane seemed perfect, cheap, and in need of renovation. They dismissed the whispers about the house as local superstition. They were practical people, not easily swayed by ghost stories. Besides, the price was unbeatable. Emily, an architect by profession, saw potential in the high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and spacious rooms. Jack, a contractor, was excited by the challenge of restoring the house to its former glory. They moved in with their dog Max, ready to tackle the extensive repairs. From the first night, however, things began to feel off. The house creaked and groaned like it was alive, its walls seeming to shift in the dark. Max, usually a fearless dog, refused to go near the staircase, growling at something neither Emily nor Jack could see. The first truly unsettling event occurred a few nights later. Emily woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps above their bedroom. She nudged Jack awake, but he dismissed it, saying it was probably the old house settling. Emily wasn't convinced. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and moving slowly across the floor. Determined not to let her imagination get the best of her, Emily forced herself back to sleep. But the next morning, they discovered something chilling. A single handprint smeared in dust on the mirror in the hallway, too small to be Jack's, and far too high to have been left by Max. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences only intensified. Jack started hearing whispers late at night, hushed voices that seemed to echo from the walls. He began seeing fleeting shadows at the edge of his vision, figures that disappeared the moment he turned his head. Emily was haunted by nightmares of a woman standing at the foot of their bed, her eyes wide and hollow, watching them as they slept. One evening, while working in the basement, Jack uncovered something strange. Behind a rotting wooden panel was a hidden door. It was small, almost child-sized, and locked with an old, rusted padlock. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine as he stared at it. He called for Emily, and together they debated whether or not to open it. Curiosity got the better of them, and with a crowbar, Jack pried the lock off. The door creaked open to reveal a small, dusty room with nothing but a single chair in the center. On the floor was a faded drawing, crude and childlike, of a family standing in front of a house. But something was wrong with the picture. Next to the family, there was a dark figure looming over them with no face, its hand outstretched toward the smallest figure, a little girl. Emily's blood ran cold. She backed away from the room, sensing that they had disturbed something they shouldn't have. Jack, equally unnerved, closed the door and sealed it shut, vowing never to open it again. That night, the house came alive. The walls shuddered, the air grew thick with an oppressive presence, and the whispers became screams. Emily and Jack tried to leave, but every door slammed shut in their faces. Windows that had been broken for years were now impenetrable. Max barked frantically at the staircase, his fur standing on end. Then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. It echoed through the house, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emily clutched Jack's arm, her heart racing. "We need to get out," she whispered, her voice shaking. But it was too late. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. In the pitch black, they could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. Emily fumbled for her phone to use its flashlight, but the moment she turned it on, she wished she hadn't. Standing at the foot of the stairs was the woman from Emily's nightmares, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. Behind her, the shadows shifted, revealing the dark figure from the drawing, its hand reaching out toward them. Paralyzed with fear, Emily and Jack watched as the figure moved closer, its form distorting the air around it. Max let out a final terrified yelp before disappearing into the darkness. The last thing Emily remembered before blacking out was the icy touch of the figure's hand on her skin. When she woke up, it was morning. The house was silent, and Jack was lying beside her, unconscious but alive. Max was gone, and so was the woman. The house felt different, cold, lifeless, as if whatever had haunted it had finally been sated. Emily and Jack didn't stay long enough to find out. They packed their things and left that same day, abandoning the house on Sycamore Lane for good. They never spoke about what happened that night, but they both knew the truth. The house had claimed its victims before, and it would again. The house still stands waiting for the next unsuspecting family to move in.